Building a jig to cut dovetails on your table saw is a lot like building a typical crosscut sled. So I'm going to talk about some of those similarities first, and then we'll get into the differences. Now, where it's going to start is by creating a large plywood base. Then we're going to add a bridge or a front fence to the jig. And what this does is hold the plywood base together because you're going to inevitably cut it in two as you're cutting the dovetails. Now the jig slides on a miter bar that runs in the miter gauge slot in your table saw table. Now the miter bar that we're using here is made out of phenolic. It's a type of resin. It doesn't expand and contract like wood does, but you can still cut it and shape it with all your typical woodworking tools. So it's a nice choice here. Now where things get a little bit different is for the back fence. And the fence is going to attach on the rear portion of the base, and you'll do that through a set of holes that you're going to drill. Now the first set holds the fence so that it's perpendicular to the saw blade. And you want to do that because for one set of cuts, the blade is going to be tilted and the fence is going to be square. For your other cuts, for the pins, the fence is going to be tilted and the blade is going to be square. Now we're going to be cutting dovetails with a 10-degree angle on it. So both this back position and front position are 10 degrees off of our center line. Which brings us to the second major component of the jig, and that's the fence. Now the fence is a pretty simple construction. We have a base and a face here, and it's supported by a set of 4 braces because the fence face is so tall to support a workpiece. Now with 2 of these braces, we're going to cut a slot or a dado on the inside faces. And that's to hold this piece of polycarbonate that acts as a blade cover. In the middle of cutting, the last thing that you want to do is to end up having an accident and accidentally cutting one of your fingers. So the blade cover is just a physical and a visual reminder to keep your hands away. And I did that just using a dado blade and making sure, because you're creating 2 mirror image pieces here, so that you have the dado lining up with each other. On the front of the jig, we'll need to cut a groove to hold a length of T-track that's going to hold some adjustable keys. I'll get to that in just a little bit. Now to cut that groove, I set up a dado blade on the table saw and sized it to match the width of that T-track. Not all T-track is exactly the same, so you're going to want to make a couple of test cuts to dial in the fit. Once that's done, one other cut that you'll need to make is a channel across the center of the face, and that's to hold a replaceable hardboard backer. Now to hold the backer in place, the channel is shaped like a dovetail. Seems to make sense considering the jig that we're working on here. So in order to make this, I headed over to the router table and installed the dovetail bit. The height of the bit matches the thickness of the hardboard. Now because of how wide this is, you're just going to have to make that in a series of passes, working your way from one side of the dado to the other. I used a miter gauge to guide the piece and to keep it square. Once you're done, it's a good idea to sand the bottom surface just to have a smooth, even surface to reference these replaceable inserts on. The inserts, like I said, are just made out of hardboard, and they have a matching slope on each side to fit securely into that dovetail channel. Make a few of these while you're at it, because as you're cutting the dovetails, it's slowly going to get chewed up. You can just flip it around and get double duty out of it, but over time you're just going to want to have a few extras to replace later on. Now the fence itself attaches to the base with a pivot bolt on one end and an adjustable pin on the other. Now the adjustable pin is made from a standard plastic knob that we've threaded a section of a long bolt into it and then cut off the threads so that it's just the smooth shank. And that's going to allow the fence to get a nice registration in each of the holes as you adjust it. Now the only other thing that you'll need to make here is a set of keys that will fit into the T-track. It doesn't really matter the size of the keys. You're going to make them to match the size and the spacing of the dovetails that you're going to create. You can make them out of MDF like these or plywood, and again, make them to match the size that you want. That's starting to get into the use of this jig, and for that I'm going to turn things back over to Logan to show you how this works.
When it comes to using dovetails in a project, most of the time people think about either hand cutting them or using a router jig to cut them. But with this jig that Phil built, we can go ahead and cut those dovetails here at the table saw. Now we'll talk about the jig in a minute. First, let's talk about the blade, because you do need a special blade for this. The blade that I've loaded up in here is a specially ground dovetail blade. That means the top of each tooth is at a certain angle. In this case, it's 10 degrees. So to create a flat bottomed kerf, we're going to tilt the blade to match the grind of the tooth. So in this case, it's 10 degrees. And I just used a digital magnetic angle gauge, snapped on to the blade and tilted it until the readout is at 80 degrees or 10 degrees from 90. One of the beauties about this jig is that you don't have to lay out your dovetails on each workpiece. Instead, what we'll do is we'll lay out our dovetails on one end of one workpiece, and on the rest of the workpieces, we'll simply scribe out a shoulder line. And that shoulder line matches the thickness of the mating workpieces. Now to create the tails, we're going to use a series of spacers that slide into these T-tracks here. So the first thing we're going to do is make a kerf in this newly made jig. We're going to set the blade height to match that shoulder line. So now we'll take our workpiece that we have laid out our dovetails on, and we're going to align this so that we're going to make our first cut on the half pin that's going to be on the edge. There we go. So now that I have that tightened down, we're going to make a cut. We'll spin it around, make another cut, then we'll also flip the workpiece end for end and make that cut on both shoulders on the opposite end. We'll do that on both of the workpieces that have the tails on them. So now we have the first kerf made for the half pins. Now we go ahead and do the first full pin. And to do that, we're going to remove this hardboard backer, and we're going to slide in a spacer. Now the spacer is going to position the board a little bit further in, and the spacer is really designated by the size of dovetails you're making. The spacer size is equal to the width between the first full pin and the half pin in the center of the waist area. So you can kind of see that guy there. So we'll slide this guy into place, tighten it down. We'll go and put our backer piece back in. And then we can just position our workpiece, verify with our laid out dovetails that the kerf is going to be in the right spot. So we'll make that kerf, and we'll flip it around, make another cut, then we'll flip it end for end, make those two cuts, and then we'll swap that out for our other tailboard. We're going to make those cuts on both tailboards, and then we're going to add one more spacer. And this spacer is going to position it for that final cut on the inside of the tail that's left. So once that final cut's made, I'm going to do a little chisel work to remove the waste that's left, then we'll talk about making it the pins. So now that I have all the waste chopped out of our tailboards, we can go ahead and use these guys to lay out our pins. And I've done that here. And we just need to lay out one end of the workpiece like we did with the tails, but make sure you clearly mark where the waste area is. Otherwise, you could end up cutting on the wrong side of the line. So I've reset the table saw up, and I've put in a ripping blade. And I've reset it to 90 degrees. And this is what we used to cut the sockets out. And I've also adjusted the fence here. I've adjusted this from the square position to the first 10-degree mark that Phil made. So now it's a simple matter of positioning our board and setting our first stop block. I've removed all the spacers. Setting our first stop block to cut inside the waist area on that first socket. And what we're going to do is we're going to sneak up on the cut until that first half pin fits in that shoulder area that we removed on the tail board. Once we have that fitting how we want it, we'll make that cut, and then we will flip the workpiece and cut that first half pin on the opposite corner. Then we'll do that on both of the pin boards, and then we'll go ahead and add the spacers in to continue to cut the joints. Okay, so with those first cuts made, now we can simply pull the pin, pivot this to the next 10-degree mark, and that's going to allow us to cut the opposite side of the joint. The process here is going to be exactly the same. We'll sneak up on that half pin fit, and we'll add the spacers to cut the rest of the joints. Okay, there we go. So after flipping the fence to the opposite 10-degree angle and cutting the other face on those pins, all you have left to do is reset the fence and nibble away the waste. You'll be left with a couple little corners that are easy to clean up with the chisel. But then, after you have those all cleaned up, a little bit of glue, some sanding, you'll be left with really nice dovetails that people might not believe are made at the table saw.
Building easy-to-use jigs like this drawer joint jig or the dovetail jig for your table saw not only helps you do better work, I think it also helps you enjoy the time that you spend in your shop. Woodsmithplans.com. Hundreds of professional, high-quality woodworking plans right at your fingertips. Every single plan is presented as an easy-to-download digital package that includes pages of step-by-step instructions, full-color photos, illustrations, and exploded views, retail sources for hardware and supplies, plus a cutting diagram and materials list. Many plans offer handy video overviews and guides. Plus, we're proud to offer our plans in both standard and metric. Everything is here, from gorgeous heirloom furniture projects to handy shop projects and upgrades, clever, cost-effective storage solutions, as well as weekend projects and accessories that are great for gifts. All fully searchable and categorized for easy browsing. Woodsmithplans.com, everything you need for building fine woodworking projects.